So today I'll be talking about archival bodies and kind of playing around with the ethos and ethics of embodied productions. And so this is a work in progress, as I'm like still getting used to these type of glasses that bring things closer and further. So here we go.
Transitions.
Yeah. So it's a work in progress toward the completion of my book project that traces my development of a queered archival methodology as a flexible framework that can guide archivists to critically engage with their daily archival work and then to inquire into the efficacy and material consequences of their selected archival methods. So in my ongoing research, I'm working to develop the concept of the archival body, and this means that I use the body as a framework through which to investigate the archives, archival records, archival practices, archival uses, and the ways that their meanings and material implications shift temporally, spatially, and contextually. It also means that I'm attentive to the participants in the co-construction of the archives, those archivists, contributors, and the visitors to the archives. I consider not only the individual bodies that might constitute an archive, but the sometimes competing, contradictory, and even contested bodies of knowledge that inform them. And as an archivist and archival scholar, as well as a filmmaker and media studies scholar, I'm particularly interested in embodied productions, how people make meaning in and for the archives. And for me, oral history is an important method as I attend to storytelling strategies, and mediated as well as embodied practices of storytelling. I'm interested in the question of how best to capture stories. Drawing from queer theory, phenomenology, affect, and embodiment, I engage archives and the bodies that constitute them to critically question how they inform and shape one another. I question the neo-colonizing effects of normativized archival practices, along with the neoliberal structures that uphold exclusionary power dynamics. I'm not in search of practices that flatten hierarchies, I am in search of practices that flatten hierarchies and that are not only accessible, but also flexible. So today I'll draw on one oral history interview to instantiate the tensions that emerge within my own archival work, as well as to highlight how the queered archival methodology helps me to navigate and work within those generative and dynamic tensions. So today I introduce you to J. Kyle Peterson.
Her name was Alice Glendora Peterson. Her maiden name was Ziegler. And she was the nurse's aide in the hospital where I was born, in the pediatric ward. So she knew I was different all along.
So I'll first introduce key terms and concepts at play in today's presentation, and then I'll share interview segments to instantiate the relationship I've come to understand between ethos and ethics. As an emerging case study, this is just the first interrogation into Jay's individual archival collection as part of the Arizona Queer Archives. I approach the archives through a transdisciplinary frame to be understood as both a location and a practice. As a location, archives are those professionally managed repositories that collect, appraise, preserve, and make accessible for archival users. As a practice, the archives and the acts of archiving are, and now following archival scholar Eric Ketelaar and queer theorist Nikki Sullivan, the techniques and technologies that might perform stories and memories. So consider these techniques and technologies the way we see, know, feel, move, act, and belong. And in this work, engaging bodies and archives, there's certainly an obsession with the flesh. Bodies as those, quote, physical structures of persons or animals, including the bones, flesh, and organs, unquote. But also to connect to the archives, the greater and more pliable dynamic structures beyond the flesh and into the bodies of knowledge and ways of knowing and being. I understand embodiment as a process, not a given, and as ongoing. Archival bodies take shape and reciprocally shape the records creators who engage with the archives through records, collections, practices, and productions. Both bodies and archives are about configurations and unbecomings, which are the simultaneous becomings and unbecomings that influence the ways we move, relate, and become culturally legible through time and space. The archival body exists then in the liminal space and time between past and future. Connected then to bodies and embodiment and those ways we know and move in the world, I begin with an understanding of ethos as, quote, an atmosphere spirit, climate, disposition, and essence, unquote. I like to think about it as one's character that permeates one's being and influences one's knowing and interacting with the world. Ethos directly relates to embodiment and lived experiences that may or may not emerge as some sort of expertise or distinct lived knowledge. Through Aristotle, ethos relates to establishing one's credibility. I move beyond classical rhetoric and especially rhetorical attention to speech to also include performance and performativity, what Judith Butler defines as, quote, a repetition and a ritual which achieves its effects through its naturalization in the context of the body, understood in part as a culturally sustained temporal duration, unquote. In terms of the Arizona Queer Archives, I'm working with local community members to establish and learn to sustain a participatory ethos, an important part of the queered archival methodology. Consider this then the participatory nature or character of the archives. Meanwhile, I understand ethics to also be generated through interaction and lived experience. Ethics are distinct from ethos in that they are situated more publicly and often structured and codified and then assented to. Information studies scholar Kay Mathieson here in our School of Information suggests that ethics, especially information ethics, is related to access with a focus on the importance and the value of such information to a person. Therefore, she argues that ethics is the relation between a person or persons and information. Political theorist Jane Bennett defines ethics as, quote, a complex set of relays between moral contents, aesthetic affective styles, and public moods, unquote. Both definitions focus on relational interactions and especially those connected to value judgments and affective relationships. Ethos and ethics then are dynamic in ways and reliant on interactive and reactive relationships that people and archivists in this context have with records creation, and archival practices that may more explicitly call forward tense moments of reflexivity. As both a scholar and as director of the Arizona Queer Archives, such movement within the archives urges me to understand and explore the archival body as both temporally situated and also always in motion, both and. In her book, Dust, the Archive and Cultural History, Carolyn Steedman suggests that, quote, all we know is a sequence of fixations in the spaces of the being's stability, unquote. So using queer theory alongside archival theory, I argue for queered approaches to archiving and interrogating the archives in order to be attentive to the multiple lived experiences that constitute the archival body, as well as just even one archival collection. Queered archives are those spaces through which meaning is made in order to demonstrate the converging and diverging relationships that records and records creators have with dominant meta-narratives. And here I use queered with a / to represent the moving between a present and past tense verb to highlight the multiple ways to understand the past, present, and future through the adjective, verb, and noun simultaneously. The / for me also represents unbecoming through the taking apart and coming together, much like the cut and edit in video and film production. And for me, queering archives upsets the normative archival structures that may uphold and reproduce exclusionary hegemonic power dynamics. Therefore, I understand the queered archives as both intelligible as archives and queer, through which one might imagine the possibilities of, quote, queer multimodality as a function of both a recovered and an emerging history of queer material lives. Just one collection may contain, now quoting Jack Halberstam, different histories of transition between old and new modes of representation, unquote. Therefore, the archival body is not static. Archives are dynamic, both settled and unsettled, generative, and importantly, unsettling. Following Sue McKimmish and Ann Gilliland's work to identify distinct methodological strains within archiving and record keeping, practical approaches are, quote, continually interacting and evolving sets of contingent activities with individual, institutional, and societal aspects, unquote. Through ongoing interaction, then, outcomes may never be guaranteed, thus making urgent my study into dynamic tensions. The Arizona Queer Archives, the AQA, is a collecting archives that I founded in 2011 through the University of Arizona's Institute for LGBT Studies. And importantly, through the application of the queered archival methodology, the AQA is being developed with members of the LGBTQI communities through a participatory ethos and allows for the connection between archival theory and practice with queer theory and queered material lives. I draw on the oral history interviews that I've collected of LGBTQI identified and for today's presentation, intersex identified individuals.
My name is J. Kyle Peterson with an E, and I'm 62 years old. I decided to tell my story today because it's important that I get it documented because I exist, because my life has existed and I happened.
So J. Kyle Peterson is the first self-identified intersex participant in the Arizona Queer Archives. Shortly after the December 2013 Jim Lewis Symposium at the UA Institute for LGBT Studies titled Intersex, Medical, Cultural, and Historical Context, I was contacted by Jay to tell his story for the Arizona LGBTQ Storytelling Project, the oral history acquisition component of the AQA. And so on 23 April 2014, I conducted Jay's oral history interview at my home, and generally through ongoing conversations with interviewees to set up our scheduled interviews where they are most comfortable, I've conducted the majority of oral history interviews in living rooms and patios in the greater Tucson metro area. But for Jay, his home was out of the question because he felt the trailer where he was living was too cramped. I suggested the conference room in the building where the AQA is located, but he said that there would not be enough privacy. So I invited him to my home and I made a plate of fresh fruit and cheeses for our time together. When he arrived, he changed into a nice and more formal button-up shirt and settled into a chair in the living room. And together he and I made the list of questions that he thought most relevant for me to ask. But once I started with the first question, he continued through his storytelling with little opportunity for me to inquire or interject.
Relatives would rather propagandize or say to whatever that I don't exist or that my life never happened or I was one they don't want to talk about. And I want it archived that I lived and that my life counts, that I'm here and that I'm a brave person and that the truth, I want the truth to be documented because it's important. I was born intersexed. I'm 62 years old, and I want people, students, and medical people, and social workers, and other people in the LGBTQI community to always have access to look at this film, to learn from it, to take whatever good they can from it, not only for themselves personally, but to pass on to other people. So that it's not lost.
So on camera, Jay showed me his paintings and the photos from his childhood, young adulthood, and his breast removal. Then he left. The interview lasted for 2 hours. I know he was ready to take a break, and I realized I was feeling emotionally and physically depleted. I inquired into his story and storytelling process to ask, how do ethos and ethics structure the interview, the storytelling practices, and the assumptions about the role of the archives? I was affectively and emotionally moved by his story, his tears, his photos and dresses, his experiences of abuse, and especially his persistence to figure out his body and the shifting diagnoses he had received over time. And
so I didn't get a correct diagnosis as an intersex.
Here we go. Returning to Steedman's suggestion that all we know is a sequence of fixations, I consider the timing of this particular interview the story so far. If this interview took place 5 years earlier, what sequence of fixations? 10 years earlier, when he was 20, in the coming years. Because archivist work is often guided by codes of ethics, internationally as well as nationally, I'm especially interested in those spaces identified as community archives or community-focused archives, and how participation and representation in archival productions may challenge ethical appraisal, description, and access. How do the needs of the archival body at a given moment in time and place relate to the codes of ethics for archivists? If ethics, and quoting Jane Bennett now, are a code to which one is obligated, a set of criteria to which one assents or subscribes, unquote, How might the affective dimensions of ethics be recognized? Codes and criteria are vital parts of ethics, but are bodies prepared to be open to the surprises that regularly interrupt life? How are bodies in the archival body implicated in the enactment of ethical objectives? This requires bodily movements, choreography as part of the gestures and performances in archival productions, as well as a distinctive coming together of affective forces. Here is the dynamic tension between ethics and ethos that Jay's participation in the AQA makes visible. As I maintain a professional relationship with donors to the archives, as highlighted in the Society of American Archivists Code of Ethics for Archivists, I must recognize the personal, the individual ethos that permeates the production of the archival record that Jay and I do together. I must recognize the role I play in promoting the archival ethos as a space where multiple histories and lived knowledges might be welcomed and preserved. I argue that the role of archives to be attentive to both enduring and enduring values of records creators, and their contextual histories. I draw on Michelle Caswell's and Marika Seafor's research that advocates for an ethics of care that considers the affective and emotional social justice work that takes place within the archives. Jay implies that it is the archives that gives him, quote, the right to speak. For him, the oral history is recorded evidence, and the archival body is understood as structured to hold, preserve, and make accessible for future generations. I draw on Caswell, Seafor's, and Mario Ramirez's article, To Suddenly Discover Yourself Existing, Uncovering the Impact of Community Archives, to connect ethos directly to affective belonging, whether it's belonging to a group, community, an archives, a history, or even to yourself. The concept of representational belonging that the authors develop suggests that the archives might empower non-normative peoples in ways to make urgent and emerging, quote, autonomy and authority to establish, enact, and reflect on their presence in ways that are complex, meaningful, substantive, and positive to them in a variety of symbolic contexts, unquote. Jay's story unfolds through family shame, secrets, and societal shifts in understanding the body, as well as the relationships between sex, sex organs, sexuality, and gender. His questions are unanswered and become marked and fixed moments in his history, and that they tell of those stories.
I didn't get a correct diagnosis as an intersex person until 2001, here in Tucson, with a medical doctor who then promptly sent me to the U of A library to do research, and I was like, God. And once she said, you're not transsexual, you're intersex, it was like, all this tension left me. I felt like a guy who had gotten rid of a pinchy set of shoes, put on the right set of shoes. I was like, oh, is that the name for what I am? Oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense.
So Jay's anxiety and sense of unbelonging are unsettling, but as a multimodal archival collection that includes this oral history interview, his diaries, his paintings, cassette tape recordings, music composition, research into his misdiagnoses, and photo albums support the dynamic nature of the archival body as temporal fixations that tether the unbecoming body for the time being. Jay's email to me the day after his oral history interview read, "Thank you, Jamie, for the filming. It was so important to me to be preserved on film so the future people know I did exist, since family wants nothing to do with me. I also appreciate it was at your house. I felt comfortable and relaxed. Chair was comfortable, animals, surroundings. I was never out as intersexed until November 2012. I think I forgot to talk about that. I should come back to film that, don't you think? What do you think? I came out then at the U of A during Transgender Week. It changed my life. Now I like myself." And so he and I are currently working on scheduling a follow-up interview so that he can share what he identifies as the positive parts of his life, since he thinks that the first 2 hours were situated mostly on the negative. And so what this case study is suggesting for me is that archives must be attentive to and able to support the shifting and emerging histories as further evidence of understanding that archival bodies as assemblages of stories so far. So thank you.
I'm just wondering, you know, being situated in this department, have you thought through some of the relationships between your work and other work? That's a very difficult question, but I imagine you've kind of thought about it. That's just kind of a conversation I'd like to have.
Well, I know with Dawn and Kay's work, and Jessica also with backgrounds in philosophy and studying ethics, Kay and I have talked over a glass of wine about this type of stuff a little bit, and I know your work as well. There are a lot of overlaps with just thinking through the dynamic unfolding of the archive, and not necessarily this idea, the paradigm, the rigidness of the archives, so really thinking about these more fluid boundaries. And so I think, it's kind of been ongoing conversations, so. And so much more to learn as, we keep going, and even just thinking about like Jay's story and how the archives are filled with so many stories like that, and it's not easy just, jotting it down, here's the description, and it's like, well, now that person no longer identifies that way, so how do we see our role too to like update records too, or think through that process to make things more fluid.
Well, so in your presentation, it's more as if an archive, as it's being created, is actually a community. I mean, so certainly the archive it's always been the case, and other people have said are filters. But when you're dealing with the actual person that's being archived, it seems that, in many archives, the archivist does not change the subject. They interpret or select, but they don't change. But in this case, it looks like because you have direct interaction with the subject of the archive, you indeed, the act of being archived changes the person being archived. So you're actually changing the person, and therefore are the agent by which you may have to do another version a while later because someone's come to see themselves differently. So what do you think your role as a scholar is when you're having that impact? So how do you decide?
Well, one of the things also to think about is the Australian, they have the records continuum paradigm, which means the archivist changes the record in our work. So it's not necessarily that the record is what it is. We do interpret and shape the record in our naming, and then as visitors come in, it continues to be shaped. And so they have expanded the idea of the records creator to include even visitors to the archive and the archivist as all having hands in shaping. And so that seems to be like taking hold in like community archival studies with Andrew Flynn and Mary Shepard's work. And like Ann Gilliland and Michelle Caswell at UCLA are really looking at the records continuum versus what we have the life cycle of the record, like the record's born and then the record dies. But there's more of a rigidness of what we understand as the record. And so they're looking at ways, so I think probably my scholarship fits more in that line of thinking in terms of like shifting temporalities.
But it's also the case that you're changing Ray.
Jay?
Yeah. So
Well-
aren't you you're an influence in other people's lives, the people who you're documenting?
Well, that's one of the things, thinking that just here's an archive, and Michelle Caswell, that article, To Suddenly See Yourself Existing, they're looking at the South Asian American Digital Archive and how that's changing lives by just being present.
Right.
That now people have a whole sense of belonging, but it gets tricky when we start to see like who feels they have the right to cross the threshold to be archived. And so that type of challenging symbolic annihilation in ways to then feel a belonging, but often it is entrenched in respectability politics and how do you be the best then South Asian American to fit. Or even for this archive, the people that came forward to tell their stories first were usually the gay white men. And it's taken how many years for the first intersex identified person to come forward, and we are lacking a lot of women of color. So you start to see that there's certainly a hierarchy that people feel changed just by hanging out your shingle archive, and LGBTQ, and it's like, oh, I fit under that umbrella, but then there's such distinct difference in the communities within each letter too. So there is like mutual shaping. Like where I leave changed, the archive has changed, having Jay's interview and Jay leaves changed, like, as if, like, now he belongs to something and he's on the
Right.
record. So just thinking about that idea of being fixed and captured, that all of a sudden I'm fixed into this moment and I am someone.
Right.
And you see that in the storytelling, just the process that, I guess that's one of the I hate using the word unique, but those things that stand out about being a collecting archives that is constantly doing oral histories and you know, in the community doing workshops on creating your own archival collection, like people then are changed by thinking archivally too. So that's a great question to think through, like these mutual shapings.
I have a related question. In the scholarly circles, are they mainly talking about human archives and human experiences? And I mean, it's all human, but like I'm looking at job placement data for an MALIS. A lot of it is corporate, so they might end up archiving the histories of buildings. And I can see that that kind of archive could be a little more static comparatively. I mean, maybe that, you know, that the story of the history of the Harville building that we're in, for example, would still maybe take different shape depending on the storyteller and that sort of thing. But the story of a human, and certainly we humans change. You know, we're looking at 30 years of Hillary Clinton on the news, and you know, when they pull in old stuff, you know, it does, humans change over time at a different rate as other things in the world. So are they separating out these discussions, or are they talking generally on just sort of all archives in general, and this is our thinking on, like in Australia, is it about archiving ephemera or performed activity or human interaction, or is it a more general conversation about archives?
Well, I actually think they're looking at like the material also as decaying and changing over time. So even a building changes, and thinking how it's connected technologically, socially, and you know, within urban spaces or not urban, but it's always in relation to kind of, I think, the world it's interacting with it. And so, you know, thinking through the history, those, as you continue to gather material about that particular building, it does change over time. And so I think that they're looking at many things, and then scholars at Maryland looking at like the transitioning, you know, word processing technologies, but always through also human engagement, which is interesting to think just how the processes change. And so I think over time, that will be the significant part, is the process that we see unfolding in relation to human access, I guess.
Yeah.
In sort of a lot of information repositories like a library, you can distinguish at least three separate players. There's the reader that's getting the information, there's the author that's transmitting the information, that's testifying, and then there's the subject matter, you know, whoever happens to be the subject matter of the work. And you can often sort of treat these as just distinct groups that are non-overlapping, and consider the ethical considerations, like does the reader have intellectual freedom? Is the privacy of the subject protected, and so on? Are there any sort of ethical issues that arise in this specific context, given that we wouldn't sort of normally think of, given that there seems to be a clear overlap between those? Because if so, for example, in this case, Jay is the subject matter and the testifier at the same time. So.
Well, you know, just thinking through like the codes of ethics that are through the ICA and the Society of American Archivists, and how with libraries it's so about open access and freedom of information, but with archives there we have the opportunity for restrictions to be placed. And so in his collection there are a number of boxes that are restricted, and like he hasn't stipulated on his deed of gift yet, like will they ever be open if he dies? Will they be available, or will they always be restricted? And so thinking of ethically about that too, like what happens in a person's lifespan, and is there, like, I'm drawing a blank on what the word is, but where then a certain time period has passed and all of a sudden it's open. So that's one of the questions ethically to think about, like, someone should see that, or, that should be open. Like, those are some of the conflicting things with archives and archivists, that they think sometimes they want open access. But then it's like, oh, wait a minute, but we have to still protect vulnerable populations, and if they request restrictions. So it really becomes how they are enforced. And then as new like directors come into the archive, or new archivists, like how to ensure that there's still safety.
So how does that get negotiated? Do the restrictions that the donors want to place, are those always accepted, or do you say, well, we can't take this material under those conditions, or we won't record you if you're not going to,
Mm-hmm.
I don't.
Well, so far at the Queer Archive, we've accepted people's restrictions, but then there are some that we had meetings after to talk about, like, why did they want it to be restricted, and thinking, because our digital repository is through Amica, and so some of the oral history interviews are uploaded there, and people have given permission, but then there are a few people that were like, but that means it's public, it's like YouTube, and then they started to freak out that it's open, and just thinking how then it can be shared. So it was really interesting just how they understood even social media, and thinking if it's streaming, it no longer belongs to me, and people can then download it and re-edit it, and that type of thing, it was pretty controversial political storytelling from like the 70s and the lesbian feminists, and it was really like, okay, well, we don't have to post this part, so that lives on a videotape on the shelf, but not in the repository. But it becomes ongoing negotiations, I think, too, as they start to see, like, oh, we can trust the repository, or we can trust that people aren't going to be doing those types of things. So really understanding more of like technology and social media as a whole allows, like, oh, I see a digital repository doesn't mean my stuff is going to be all over TMZ or whatever, or Access Hollywood. So it's a big learning curve, when you're working also with populations that haven't even done email. And when they hand in, it's like those old printers with the perforated edges we have to tear off to fit into the archive folders. So really seeing a long track record of some materials. So good questions.